The history than almost anyone here present. All this, I hope, is made explicit in the video, if we can get it to work, which will be shown to you shortly. An opening address is a bit of a sermon or an exhortation. In a sense, I am recuperating my personal, extremely short passage through a very brief period of time. By my participation in these activities, I am making rods to beat my back. But Debord has said that the IS, which was an artistic movement and not a legally constituted body, was no longer to serve as a cover for its members. It is not, therefore, because one has been expelled that one necessarily ceases to hold the same ideas or that one's opinions and praxis are altered. Nothing I have said or shall say should be taken as representing anything more than the subjective misunderstandings of an event by an interested and committed bystander. Now we go for a conjuring trick. This strip of paper is an early situationist défi. It says, aux producteurs de l'art moderne, si vous êtes fatigués d'imiter des démolitions, s'il vous apparaît que les redites fragmentaires que l'on attend de vous sont dépassées avant d'être, prenez contact avec nous pour organiser à un niveau supérieur de nouveaux pouvoirs de transformation du milieu ambiant. International Situationniste, 32, rue Montagne-Geneviève, Paris 5. I will attempt to translate that. To the producers of modern art, if you are tired of imitating demolitions, if you feel that the fragmentary repetitions that are expected of you are stillborn, get in touch with us to organize at a higher level new ways of transforming the world around you. International Situationist, 32 Rue Montagne-Geneviève, Paris 5. That early text or challenge was not financed by the CIA, nor indeed by the ICA. I had hoped to include a joke in these brief opening remarks. I have none. But at least there is a piece of scurrilous disinformation for you to laugh at. And I'm quoting. Last month, in a leading Village Voice article, it was revealed that Debord had been recruited by the CIA in the very first years of the SI and had been receiving regular payments from its Parisian offices. This long-concealed information was only unearthed by chance during laborious research into American security information made recently available. That piece of ludicrous nonsense appeared on Wednesday, the 21st, in a Murdoch newspaper. No, not the Sun, but the Times. A certain Adrian Danat had the effrontery to sign it. That's enough about that. This exhibition is, of course, a banalized recuperation of the IS. The booklet which the ICA have produced contains some interesting documents. It is, however, curious, in view of the Situationists' well-known attitude to copyright, that the two documents in it that are specifically copyrighted are by the exhibition's curators. History of the past is necessarily vitiated by the present and by the commentary which infiltrates the documentation. This exhibition is a partial documentation of the activities of the IS. Everything, however, has been published or deposited in public archives. But there is no future in the past. The sacralization of veterans would be a collaboration with everything the Situationists contested. Hopefully, these discussions will not waste too much time on anecdote and nostalgia, but will generate the seeds of future revolutionary actions. At the opening on Thursday, I was handed a tract at the door which was a feeble imitation of Situationist interventions. Imitation is the sincerest form of spectacular recuperation. Surely you can do better than that. I have an announcement to make, which is relevant. The London Psychogeographical Committee has asked me to announce that after a congress au Fad in central France, it was decided on the 19th of June 1989 that the strike, which has been in force since 57, I beg your pardon, and which has been followed with exemplary solidarity by every comrade, has been conditionally suspended. And finally, I would like to point out that Debord is not an Ayatollah. That's it. Do I get off this platform?
I think you can stay up there.
Oh, right.
All right. If you're comfortable up there.
Well, I've got an ashtray.
I think the video is going to be later on, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's going to change. Shall I go in here? So, thank you. We're not sure if we're going to use these mics or not. I'm Mathew Collings, and this is Mark Francis, one of the organisers of the show. And I just want to read a couple of passages of Situationist writing to establish a couple of things. One is the sense of period flavour of this show, and with the first passage, which is the longest one, the idea that the initial Situationist writings obviously were a very accurate description of post-war culture, and that's part of our attraction to them now, the way that they pinpoint whoever is attracted to it now. The way that the writings in tone of voice and in their sort of comments pinpoint a sort of cultural moment and indicate possibilities for resistance within this post-war culture, and of course pinpoint sort of the pseudo-resistors. So I'm reading first from this anthology that I expect Situationist fans will be familiar with. This is the longest passage. After that, short ones. This is called. This was published in 1958, and it's called "The Sound and the Fury." It goes, "There's a lot of talk these days about angry, raging youth. People are fond of talking about them because, from the Swedish adolescents' aimless riots to the proclamations of England's angry young men trying to form a literary movement, there is the same utter innocuousness, the same reassuring flimsiness, products of a period in which the dominant ideas and ways of living are decomposing," this is 1958, "a period of major breakthroughs in the domination of nature without any corresponding increase in the real possibilities of everyday life. Reacting often crudely against the world they find themselves stuck in, these youth outbursts are roughly reminiscent of the surrealist state of mind. But they lack surrealism's points of leverage in culture and its revolutionary hope. Hence the tone underlying the spontaneous negativity of American, Scandinavian and Japanese youth is one of resignation. Saint-Germain-des-Prés had already, during the first years after World War II, served as a laboratory for this kind of behavior, misleadingly termed existentialist by the press, which is why the present intellectual representatives of that generation in France, Françoise Sagan, Rob Grillet, Vadim, the atrocious Buffet, are all such extreme caricatural images of resignation. Although this intellectual generation exhibits more aggressivity outside France, its consciousness still ranges from simple imbecility to premature self-satisfaction with a very inadequate revolt. The rotten egg smell exuded by the idea of God envelops the mystical cretins of the American Beat generation and is not even entirely absent from the declarations of the angry young men, for example, Colin Wilson. These latter have discovered 30 years behind the times a certain moral subversiveness that England had managed to completely hide from them all this time, and they think that they're being daringly scandalous by declaring themselves Republicans. Plays continue to be produced, writes Kenneth Tynan, that are based on the ridiculous idea that people still fear and respect the crown, the empire, the church, the university, and polite society. This statement is indicative of how tepidly literary the angry young men's perspective is. They have simply come to change their opinions about a few social conventions without even noticing the whole change of terrain of all cultural activity so evident in every avant-garde tendency of this century. The angry young men are, in fact, particularly reactionary in their attribution of a privileged redemptive value to the practice of literature. They're defending a mystification that was denounced in Europe around 1920 and whose survival today is of greater counter-revolutionary significance than that of the British Crown. In all this revolutionary babble, there is a common lack of understanding of the meaning and scope of surrealism, itself naturally distorted by its bourgeois artistic success. A continuation of surrealism would in fact be the most consistent attitude to take if nothing new arose to replace it. But because the young people who now adopt it are aware of surrealism's profound exigency while being incapable of overcoming the contradiction between this exigency and the immobility accompanying its pseudo-success, they take refuge in the reactionary aspects present within surrealism from its inception. That is magic, or a belief in a golden age elsewhere than in history to come. Some of them even congratulate themselves on still being there, so long after the period of real struggle under surrealism's Arc de Triomphe. There they will remain faithful to their tradition, says Gérard Legrand proudly, and he quotes from a contemporary periodical, a small band of youthful souls resolved to keep alive the true flame of surrealism. A movement more liberating than the surrealism of 1924, a movement Breton promised to rally to if it were to appear, cannot easily be formed because its liberativeness now depends on its seizing the more advanced material means of the modern world. But the surrealists of 1958 have not only become incapable of rallying to such a movement, they are even determined to combat it. But this does not eliminate the necessity for a revolutionary movement in culture to appropriate with greater effectiveness the freedom of spirit and the concrete freedom of mores claimed by surrealism. We're drawing to the end now. For us, surrealism has been only a beginning of a revolutionary experiment in culture, and for us, I believe he refers to Situationists, an experiment that almost immediately ground to a halt, practically and theoretically. We have to go further. Why can we no longer be surrealists? Certainly not in obedience to the ruling class's constant encouragement of avant-garde movements to dissociate themselves from the scandalous aspects of surrealism. This encouragement is not made in the name of promoting originality at all costs. How could it be, when the ruling order has nothing really new to propose to us, nothing going beyond surrealism? On the contrary, the bourgeoisie stands ready to applaud any regressions we might lapse into. If we are not surrealists, it is because we don't want to be bored. And he concludes by saying, decrepit surrealism, raging and ill-informed youth, well-off adolescent rebels lacking perspectives but far from lacking a cause, boredom is what they all have in common. The Situationists will execute the judgment that contemporary leisure is pronouncing against itself. So we're here today, 30 years later, this exhibition, which of course is now the absolute centre of contemporary leisure, and our talk is at the centre of contemporary leisure for those who can afford to come. How then do we look at the show now in the light of our current commodity culture, which clearly was glimpsed very brilliantly by Debord, but not at all prophesied in all its intricacy? Debord himself is never seen. We never see his films. He's deliberately made himself a recluse. We hear little bits and pieces about him, that he's rather fat now, he lives in Paris, he listens to shortwave radio broadcasts all the time. He recently published an essay which consisted of a description of a war game that he played. Apart from these bits and pieces, he's not engaging in our contemporary leisure culture in any way. And I wonder how, if this contemporary situation is glimpsed by Debord, how he could possibly have glimpsed a phenomenon like certain of the Cologne artists in the last 10 years, or Jeff Koons in particular, his ads in the magazines in the last few months, where the idea of resistance within culture is either completely absent or so complicated and so full of contradictions, the sort of key word of the Cologne artists, where contradiction seems to mean make as much money as you can and sort of jeer at the same time, where the thing has become so obscure that it's impossible really to perceive what resistance might consist in. So if we haven't got too sick of passages being read, or even if we have, we're just going to conclude with a short one now, which is indicates a simple confrontation between situationist strategies of resistance and artistic strategies. And it says something how about at one time those strategies were perceived within the situationist movement to overlap, and later on how they became separate. And the first line is from Debord himself, written about the same time as the last passage, that is the end of the 50s, which says the situationist position consists in relying on transience, in contrast to the aesthetic processes which strive to fix emotion. And I quote from an essay by Roberto Orr, who uses a quote from 1960 by Asker Jorn to reply to that position of Debord's. And this is from an essay by Jorn called The Validity of Art, or Artistic Value. And Roberto Orr uses this remark by Jorn to attack what he sees as a misunderstanding on Debord's part of the value of art. So Jorn says, after all, there is a form which gives up its content without ever becoming empty, because it always refills itself, art, spiritual creation, which retains its qualities at the very moment in which it displays its wares. The secret of this property, which some people call supernatural and metaphysical, and which others deny exists, consists in the fact that the force which is released is not to be found in the work of art. It exists in him who perceives it, if he is capable of perceiving it. The value does not proceed from the work itself, but is rather released within the spectator himself. That is the simple and material explanation of the value of a work of art and of all other values which are considered spiritual. Art is the invitation to an expenditure of energy without any specific aim other than that which the spectator himself can contribute. That is the expenditure. All who are too mean to make such an effort or completely incapable of it despise art.
Can I, I'm sorry, interject something after that? Again, Debord, because I think it, in fact, answers your question completely. Dadaïsm and surrealism are the two currents which could mark the end of modern art. Though only in a relatively conscious manner. They are contemporaries of the last great assault of the revolutionary proletarian movement. And the defeat of this movement, which left them imprisoned in the same artistic field whose decay they had announced, is the basic reason for their immobilization. Dadaism and surrealism are at once historically related and opposed. This opposition, which constitutes the most important and radical part of the contribution of each, reveals the internal inadequacy of their critique, developed one-sidedly by each. Dadaism wanted to suppress art without realizing it. That is to say, I think the translation is a bit faulty, without making it, without doing it. Surrealism wanted to realize art without suppressing it. The critical position later elaborated by the Situationists has shown that the suppression and the realization of art are inseparable aspects of the same overcoming of art. I think that fits.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I had that one ready for you before I came in.
Very good. Well, I want to now ask Mark to make an attempt to rationalize or justify the exhibition as it stands today, which of course includes a lot of post-situationist material, or material which takes off stylistically from situationism or in other ways from situationism.
Can I sing about Roberto Ort? He doesn't read Danish.
Right.
He cannot read the originals of Asger's books.
So
he doesn't know anything about Asger Jorn's background. He's just a student who is making a doctor's thesis in the schism of the situationist movement. That's all.
Okay, well, the point is taken, but we have read sort of pretty straight quotes there. So.
He's probably here too.
I think Roberto isn't in the room at the moment, but he will be along later.
Well, it's what I want to say first of all really is that it's obviously just a kind of a shorthand, but it's not a situationist exhibition or the situationist exhibition, for the obvious reasons that Ralph has already clearly explained. That something like that could not exist, and I think that we tried to recognise that in the way in which we gave the exhibition the title on the passage of a few people through a rather short period of time, which is itself a plagiarisation of the title of one of Guy Debord's films, but which seemed to us, obviously, in a sense, to firstly to give the idea that this was not a kind of short-lived movement, but one which has had ramifications for now 30-year-long period of time. Many of the people involved are still alive and are still working, and many of those people were doing things before the point at which the Situationist International was founded in 1957. But one of the kind of points of departure was when we began to think about what the justification would be to put this material together, was what could be brought together and in what context. I mean, you could imagine doing something like this not in a museum or gallery context at all, but in a library or something like that. And a lot of the material which is in the exhibition is obviously not art material in any case, and never was intended to be. So there are kind of internal contradictions about putting the things together. But it seemed to us that, and when I say us, I mean the group of people who were involved, initially Peter Wallen and myself, and then a number of other people, Tom Levine, Grill Marcus, Paul Hervé Parsi in Paris, Elizabeth Sussman in Boston, and Ivona Glaswick in London. It's become quite rare, I think, to try and deal with the kind of problems which in which you juxtaposed completely different sorts of material which you're supposed to read, material which you're supposed to look at, material which you, for other reasons, you can't sit in this space and read. So a lot of the exhibition are just kind of signals in a way to go away and do something else. But I think that what we really most wanted to do was simply to bring together what I call the material evidence of the Situationist International, the documents, the works of art up to a certain period, and indeed after this period in the early 60s, where the whole apparent split between art and politics was supposed to have been resolved, but which in fact wasn't. To bring all this stuff together, which has never been brought together before, and see what could be done with it. And then to articulate it in a kind of structured way, so that people could make a certain amount of sense of things which are very, very disparate. Really, in order to indicate lines of inquiry and ways in which people could take off from it. And that was why, although the title of the exhibition and the core of the exhibition is, in a sense, the real stuff, there's other stuff which was in the exhibition, which, in a way, has nothing to do with those people, and is produced by other people, by people who picked up the original documents at the time. I mean, certainly, although more or less everybody recognises the amazing kind of percipience of media and commodity and consumption analysis, I don't suppose any one of the Situationists really were interested in rock and roll, for instance.
I didn't seem much interested in pop art,
No, none. For obvious reasons.
Contemporary.
Yeah.
But it was supposed to have some kind of resisting element in it.
Yeah, but that's in a way, you'd better ask Ralph than I, in a way, the complete... I mean, the ICA was, at that time, more or less totally involved with pop art. And
which I contested kind of bitterly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, since we're going to get on to the contestation, I wonder if you want to wind up the statement about the show, and then we should allow Edward to come on and start off the discussion.
Well, just to finish that, really, it's just that there are obviously things in the exhibition, and here most of those things are upstairs, which are not Situationist documents or even things done by the same people, but were intended really to indicate in what directions some of these ideas had infiltrated. And it seems to me that still it's inevitable that a lot of the whole thing is completely invisible, so in a way it's kind of like radio waves or written and read things. Mm-hmm. That there's a kind of complete internal contradiction in trying to do anything of this sort in a space which is really intended for visualization.
Could I say something?
Yeah.
That it seems to me, what is curious, a remark someone made to me on Thursday evening, that despite the fact that I have described this exhibition as a recuperative banalization, it is actually a failure, because you cannot... these ideas still hold. And though I've said, and shall go on to say in this video, if it ever works, that we should that there is no future in the past. Amazingly, they are present.
Well, maybe we ought to allow Edward Ball to come up and
I'm sorry, yes.
kick off the
I'll get out of the way.
discussion to pick up there. Edward Ball is a New York-based writer on art. He's recently published a number of articles on situationism in Arts
I don't
magazine,
use that term.
on international Situationist International in various American art magazines.
Is there space for all of us?
Yeah, I'll move over.
I think, Edward, I think you should come to the centre stage. Must have a mise en scène here.
Yep. Let's do it that way. Who's missing? Aesthetics and resistance. Thank you all for coming. I have a few minutes statement, and then I'll introduce the panelists who have statements of their own. The title of the panel, Aesthetics and Resistance, because it is a conjunction, suggests that art and politics are or continue to be divided and mingle only when they are forced together in a kind of cohabitation. Without having foreknowledge of what the other panelists will say, I suspect that each of them will disagree with this and militate against it in one way or another, arguing that aesthetics and political discourse are practically speaking indistinguishable, or, to borrow a phrase from Stephen Heath, like the recto and verso of a piece of paper. But if art and politics are firmly linked, and the making of art is a political act because ideological, no one could credibly suggest that art has ever been much predisposed to resistance. Indeed, the paradigmatic relation of the court painter to his or her patron, one defined by obsequiousness, may be said to characterize present conditions in which dominant aesthetics seem almost wholly market-driven. For most of history, I think, art has found its place as the handmaiden of political and class power, holding secure hegemonic social relations and the status quo. Only infrequently, perhaps beginning with Goya, and since encompassing many instances that we might argue about today, including the Situationists International, who rejected art for an aestheticized politics, have artists participated in what Herbert Marcuse has called a great refusal, a no spoken to the face of history's victors. When the Situationist International dissolved itself in 1972 in Paris, it was apparently part out of exhaustion with their project, about which they had agitated for some 15 years. But I believe there was something else. Even that early, long before the Sex Pistols, before the Baudrillardian mania that now preoccupies criticism, something had changed. The Situationists had become too popular, somehow. Too many people, Guy Debord claimed in the text, the veritable split in the Situationist International, published in 1972, I think. Too many people wanted to join the ranks of the SI. They had become a cult. They had lost the marginality that had been central to their identity, a marginality that allowed them to leverage an oppositional or delinquent practice. Now, so many years later, many have argued in print, including myself, that we have entered the society of the situationist, that situationist rhetoric and tactics, namely détournement, about which we'll hear later in the day, and a certain globalization of the spectacle, have so penetrated everyday consciousness that the terms of resistance by aesthetic theft, cultural sabotage, and forms of simulation have become the stock and trade of the marketing industries, advertisers, and journalists. The carnivorous expansion of the marketplace into terrains of everyday life has led to the conspiracy of product developers in the consumer industries with bohemian culture, and the readaptation of formerly disused styles into new products. These tendencies represent a thorough incorporation of practices that the Situationists believed, rightly, could disturb the sleep of capitalism. But even though, as I believe, Situationist resistance has been thoroughly domesticated, one task of this panel might be to suggest where it remains, what kind of pockets in the culture there remain to be these sort of twitching epicenters of negation. And I'll name 4 and then turn the show over to others. There is a kind of guerrilla culture. In New York, there's a group that I think is very suggestive. It calls itself the Guerrilla Girls. This is an anonymous cell of agitators, women who poster throughout the city with posters outlining the exclusion of women from the art market and the exhibition market. These kind of very terse summaries of information, percentages. The Situationists, as we may remember, called for collective, anonymous cultural sabotage. There is the continuing sort of play in style and masquerade in subcultures, cross-dressing of various kinds. The book Subculture, The Meaning of Style by Dick Hebdage treated this very thoroughly a few years ago, but in a certain sense, this method, this kind of stylistic resistance has been enfeebled by its own success. There is institutional critique in institutions of art. The figure that comes to mind is Hans Haacke, who's a German-born artist living in New York for the past 22 years, who stages installations that join conceptualism with what is essentially a kind of Marxist critique of institutional culture. And there are forms of the fake and the pirated fragment. That is, say, simulations of cultural forms that take themselves quite seriously. I just came from Los Angeles, where there's a very interesting kind of fake museum that deceives you into believing that it's a museum, but it's not. It calls itself the Museum of Jurassic Technology. Those who've studied archaeology might remember the Jurassic period was a part of the Mesozoic era, and this museum purports to be a kind of exhibition of technologies developed during that period, before which there were any hominids. Other people on the panel might be able to suggest other areas. Well, we'll leave it to them. Chris Rawlins is a writer and filmmaker whose most recent film, I believe, was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, adapted from the book by Oliver Sacks. Yeah. Between 1968 and 79, he did political theater with the Red Lather Theater Company and has taught at the Slade School of Fine Arts. He's working on a film now about a man who invented a film camera, purportedly, and then disappeared without a trace at the end of the 19th century, allegedly kidnapped and murdered by Thomas Edison. Stuart Home recently wrote a book called The Assault on Culture, From Letterism to Class War, which is probably the best kind of survey of Situationist lineage and its milieu since 1945. Terry Atkinson is an artist and lecturer and will tell us more about himself later. May I start with you, Chris?
Sure. There's a period I'm really just going to tell you a few stories, brief stories about my involvement about 20 years ago. Not in Situationism at all, but in a current, I guess, which owed something to Situationism's existence. There was a time in, late 1967 when I had a job in a local swing bath, and I was reading Teach Yourself German at the same time with a view to being able to read these tomes about dating medieval capitals in Bavaria as I was about to embark on an MA in art history at the Courtauld Institute. And I was doing that one day, meant to be looking at the pool, when one of the characters got in and he took down his swimming trunks at the bottom of the deep end and just shat in front of me. And seeing that and knowing that the next day I would have to be sort of sweeping this turd down the hole, and knowing that what I was looking at was deeply alienating, this teach yourself German, came at a kind of time when I thought, well, maybe studying medieval German capitals is not the best thing to do at all. And it coincided a few weeks later with somebody coming round to our house saying, there is this Vietnam War, you'd better get involved in some way. And I'd spent 3 years at university thinking the Labour Club was the singular most boring thing I could imagine, and that politics of any kind was terrible. And that art was something that I felt so totally inadequate about anyway. And when I studied English literature at Bristol, it was a bit like Doris Lessing's introduction to the Golden Notebooks. I just could not relate to the way literature was taught in universities. Felt the only way I could answer an exam paper was somehow by parroting somebody else's view of T.S. Eliot, which is something I didn't believe in anyway. Which is how I came to art history, because I thought I could understand how a flying buttress worked. I had at least that confidence in myself that I could see architecture working, which is why I went that particular path, i.e. something about understanding I could trust my own judgment on, rather than rely in a mystified, inadequate kind of way, in feeling that Michelangelo was great because... And I had all these art books, you know, Michelangelo art books, which I bought, remaindered, admittedly, but I bought because I felt they were the thing. And it took me so many, many years to begin to trust my own judgment, in a way because of the weight, or the received weight of the judgment of what should or shouldn't be great, and how to go through that sort of jungle. So this people came round to the door and said, get involved in Vietnam, and we went down, rather frightened, to this architect's office in Soho, where a man called Mike was standing up, a bit like kind of Dresden Tonight boys. You know, he had a great map, a tube map up there, and we all had squeegees and posters. And the idea, there was about 100 people in the room, was that night all the ads of a Harrods poster were to be changed simultaneously in the central London area. And the ad read, "We clothe late every night in Times white bold against a black background." And the replacement piece read, "Every child with napalm." So that at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night, we'd all go out there, change the ad, and the ad would then read, "We clothe every child with napalm." So that was my political initiation, and it was very exciting. It worked. It was full of potential law breaking. It had all that buzz going to it. You know, you can tell the story again and again, and entice and entrance with the sort of limited danger of it. And it worked, and we did it, and felt terrific. And we did it again to a New Face in Hell poster of George Peppard's, which had Johnson's face put on it. And we did it again with numerous little stickers we designed and adapted. And I suppose to address the notion of, as it were, adapting the culture, the visual culture as it exists in the context, well, of course, lots of people have done it and still do it and have done it. And it does seem to me that in the sphere of aesthetics and resistance, there's a strong argument there. There was a recent one which people did, which was a Firestone ad, I believe. He only knows 3 words of English was the caption. And it was something like Goodyear tires or something like that. And there was a Mexican Indian in a desert with the tire tracks going into the thing. And so somebody had quite simply crossed it out and said, "Yankee, go home," which were the 3. And it was, when these things work, there is an aesthetic delight, you know, which is more than getting a crossword clue right. It's a delight in turning it about on its own terms in a beautiful way, and in a way that goes through. Well, we did a lot of that poster work over a period of a year or two and got arrested and all the usual stuff. And at the same time, running alongside that was a sort of more militant kind of action-taking group, of which I wasn't a part, but of which we got to know quite a bit. The example of the sort of things they either dreamt up or half did would be maybe 30 or 40 pairs of lovers in Grosvenor Square, one with a brace and bit, the other with a toxin, a defoliant, up against the trees, all at the same time, one drilling a hole in the tree, the other inserting the poison. So the notion is that Grosvenor Square defoliates straight away. And numerous other kinds of things like that, the extreme end of which was at the time the machine gunning of the embassy doors. So you see it began...
Wait. Don't start putting in machine guns and embassy doors, which is done by people who decide what they want to do themselves. And with any of your Leninist, vanguard, organised,
No, I wouldn't.
That, yeah? Well, you just have.
I haven't talked about the Leninist and the vanguard, have I?
Your whole bloody thing is organising 16 people around and we sent them all up with leaflets, yeah?
Yes, I suppose in order for it to happen, people had to come together and find a way of making it happen.
But people can do things on their own. I mean, that's Leninist vanguard. I mean, who was organising?
Who was
IS
organised?
IS or something?
No, it's just somebody who had an idea. No. There's no sort of party carding in what I'm talking about.
If you're talking about 60 people,
Well, I suppose all I would say is if you want to achieve something that it would be rather difficult with 2 people and would be achieved with 50 people, maybe you'd achieve it with 50 people, that's all.
Well, I'm just objecting to claiming angry brigade stuff for you. The rest of
I'm not claiming it at all. I'm saying that when it happened, it actually precipitated great difficulties amongst the people who were doing different kinds of things. And the sorts of arguments about, as it were, violent acts and aesthetic acts and aesthetically violent acts were ones that people had all the time and argued about quite heatedly, as you can imagine. And that's all. I subsequently came to teach at the Slade, where, again, the crisis showed itself in a different way, where we tried to get a lot of fine arts painters making political posters, or a group in the graphics department suggested, and a lot of people at that point began working directly in making political posters and that kind of work. And it actually, in my view, precipitated a great crisis amongst people who didn't really want to do that, yet felt the pressure that somehow they needed to be politically active, or that their fine arts training had somehow to serve a cause other than what they were, as it were, feeling in themselves. And the kind of crisis that precipitated individually, is very difficult. People go through long periods of unhappiness in finding no resolution in the course of a period of time, in this case on Dip ADs at the Slade. Anyway, I've talked a bit. We could go on. I'll stop there.
Would you like to go next?
Okay. I think I've got quite a quaint view of the Situationist International. I think it seemed to me that the motivating power behind it was to do with making a revolution. That's an event that has been completely remote from my life, and I think it's been, I think without speaking out of turn, it's been pretty remote from most people's lives here. On that level, then, I think this situation here this afternoon I took to be about talking about resistance and not about resisting. At least it doesn't feel like it, anyway. Not that I felt, and one obviously might be wrong about what is resistance, but the things for example, in my life which have felt like resistance have always had, I think, an element of fear in them. I can think of one example, and that was the picket lines in the miners' strike. Now, I'm not for the moment saying who was resisting who and in what cause or whose cause was right, but in terms of, if you like, one force, so to speak, resisting another force, that seemed to me to feel like resistance. It felt like it very directly at times when people were getting their heads beaten in, etc., etc. So, coming here this afternoon seems to be a fairly comfortable, I guess almost academic situation. The Situationist texts, and I'm not going to read from any text, but the Situationist texts do seem to be usable in any number of ways. And I think perhaps many of those uses are not anything to do with resistance at all. And if we, I guess, stick to the little handout on this, they're probably more to do with assimilation than resistance. And I'm not talking about the assimilation of the situationists, I'm talking about the assimilation of people like us who, in one way or another this afternoon, are using these things. So I guess the situation, to keep using the term, is a complex and expanded one, but is not really very hard to understand. There is, I think, no overt act of resistance attached to an event like this. That's, I guess, what I was trying to say in a rather long-winded way. So, in terms of my own area, as I said, my life, as far as I can tell, my life has never had very much to do with revolution or even revolutionary activity. Although there have been times, I think, when perhaps one's allowed oneself less skepticism and a bit more optimism with regard to that. But my own practice, my own day-to-day practice, I think, is more about commenting on forms of resistance and much less about resisting. For example, some of the work I did on the historical problems of the Anglo-Island situation is not really about, I don't think it's not really about resisting those kinds of historical pressures. It's certainly perhaps trying to make an analysis or a commentary in some way. And I think if we're talking about resistance, for example, in that context, it seems to me the Provisional IRA are resistors. Whether or not one agrees with how they resist and what they are apparently resisting for is another thing altogether. But that seems to me to be an action of resistance to a given political, ideological pressure. How long have we got each, roughly?
Take some more time.
I was reading a number of texts, obviously, and there was a text by Rysel, Situationist text, that talks about the spineless eclecticism of the kind of aestheticizing of resistant events. There's, in the same article, he also talked about the way in which many present-day so-called revolutionaries advance objections or accusations, I quote now, as if to repress the problem with their miserable reflexes acquired during the former period of their defeats and non-existence. And he goes on to say this only reveals a persistent leftist sectarian poverty, or even a miserable set of ulterior motives. Those I read in context of a withering attack on Godard, also I think by Rice, although that's unsigned, but it seemed to have his style. And it's a withering attack on Godard's aestheticism, and also an analysis, I think, of what whoever wrote that text, claims is Godard's assimilation into, I guess, what Adorno would call the culture industry, even before Godard put the ideas together. These seem to me to be interesting texts, and the business of placing them in a situation like the ICA, and of asking people, in one sense, like us, to use them as a leverage for discussion. Those seem to me to be interesting problems. And again, I think I'm using the word interesting in the sense that it has all the distance in the world from the notion of resistance. And I guess just as a final question, if you like. One would ask, I think, that whether this exhibition and those events that this exhibition directly or indirectly relates to, whether this exhibition, if you like, is a part of the subjugation of the SI to a kind of aesthetic, a tradition of aesthetic and philosophic reason. One of the things that, in a sense, I thought about more spontaneously, and that was in response to Edward's remarks, was this notion of negation. What I think might be termed, if you like, the labour of the negative inside contemporary culture. I mean, it's a long, well-established, almost comfortable, now I think, tradition, certainly in philosophy anyway, from Hegel to Adorno. It's perhaps not as well-established in what we might call fine art practice as perhaps it has been in philosophy. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean to say it's any more uncomfortable. But I think it's an idea that might be worth talking about if we're going to talk about the business of resistance and assimilation to, and I will finish on this, I quote, probably all have it in front of you. Who consider the nature, that's us, the who consider the nature of resistance and assimilation in the commodity culture. It seems to me, if we're going to consider that, possibly the idea of negation, the labour of the negative, there might be one way of talking about it. And let's not forget, I think that's what we are doing this afternoon, as I stressed in the opening remarks, we're talking about it.
Well, I guess we could do that right this moment. When you went to name resistance, you said that it involves fear, and you gave the example of the miners' strike. The Situationists thought that they were evolving a resistance that took place at the level of cultural production. Now, for you, would that be a kind of spineless eclecticism? Were the Situationists spineless eclectics who, in their belief that negation could take place at the level of cultural work, or not?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, in relation to the reason the Situationists are, so to speak, eminently visible in this situation is not simply because of the texts, but it's because of what happened in 1968. And what happened in 1968 was, I think, an event in which a lot of people felt, I think, something like I felt on a picket line in the miners' strike. And I meant, if I didn't sufficiently distinguish between those two kinds of situations, then that's obviously an inadequacy of what I said, because I meant to distinguish. But what I'm saying is, in the studio, for example, the business of resisting seems to me to be a kind of, to have that in mind seems to me to be kind of have a ludicrous self-consciousness about it. To be sat comfortably at whatever 1 o'clock in the morning, considering object X in situation Y. It may be that there is some act of resistance, but there are certain ways of if you like, relating that activity to some notion of resistance, and the ones, one of the if you like, intellectual constructions that I had in mind was what I call the labour of the negative. So, I can't answer your question directly. I wouldn't have thought they were spinelessly eclectic in any sense, and I wouldn't have thought if you were under the batons of the CRS in 1968, it didn't really matter whether you were spinelessly eclectic or not. You'd get it meted out to you, and that That's what I meant by the concrete sort of experience of the miners' strike.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you. Stuart Home?
Right.
You want to go on?
Sure. What I've got to say will be fairly brief. It's addressing the issue of recuperation in this. I'm going to address the issue of recuperation, and you'll see how I get round to it, because I'm not going to start off with that. I'm actually going to start off with asking, in a way, why we're here. I mean, why are we talking about the Situationists when very few people were interested in this subject, say 3 years ago? And I'd suggest a few reasons as to why there's this interest at the moment in the Situationists. The first reason would be that since postmodernism seems to have become unfashionable, the kind of iconoclasm of groups like the Situationists and also Fluxus has an appeal. There seems to be a sense of purpose in this kind of work. And it's not just the Situationists who there's a revival of interest in at the moment. It's a lot of work from the 60s. Fluxus, there's a big increase of interest in conceptual work, etc., etc. So it's not just the Situationists, they're riding on a wave with other things. Related to this kind of iconoclasm and sense of purpose, there seems to be with these groups, people feel a certain sense of authenticity about these groups, that they're dealing with something real, whatever that might mean. So this has an obvious appeal, say, to academics who, by taking on board some of the concepts of these groups, assimilating some of the concepts, they feel that they're perhaps also assimilating some of the radicality and authenticity of these groups. I'll give an example. Hal Foster's book, Recodings, Art, Spectacle, Cultural Politics, in which he basically uses a bastardized version of spectro-situationist theory to defend blue chip art by people like Robert Longo. Okay, and another reason for this interest in this period, not just the Situationists but also Fluxus and other groups, is to do with the art market and how the art market works. And what's happened with the art market is there's very thin pickings. Say if you want to buy old masters, and the price of Impressionist paintings is extortionate, even modernist paintings. So basically, if you want to build up a substantial collection of something now and you're starting from scratch, the best opportunity appears to be in post-war work. And obviously groups like Situationist Fluxus have been caught up in this wave in this art market wave. So people are buying Situationist objects, not only the paintings, as texts, as books. People turn these quite ephemeral leaflets and books into art objects and pay quite ridiculous prices for them. So I wanted to deal with the issue of why we were here, because you know, you can see, oh, well, look, the Situationists are on at the ICA this month, and it seems to have come from nowhere. And I think you should try and understand the reasons why we're here, to have some understanding of what's going on. Related to this process of historification, one of the things I find interesting about avant-garde groups, and I mean Futurist, Dada, etc., etc., is that the early historification of a lot of these groups tends to be done by people who are actually involved with the group. So, for example, you have Richard Hulsenbeck writing about Dada in 1920, 1936. You have people like Ken Friedman, who was involved with Fluxus, doing a lot of the historification of the actual group, which obviously affects how the group is historified, and people who tend to be involved tend to kind of elevate their position within the movement and perhaps be less critical of the movement overall, or certainly the aspect of their participation in it. And in relation to the Situationists, one of the interesting things that happened was that about the time the Situationists dissolved, Debord got the patronage of a guy called Gerald Lebovici, and through the publishing house Champs Libres was able to put out a lot of texts kind of celebrating the Situationist lifestyle. And obviously, if you're in a position to put out books, if someone's paying for you to put out books, people read the books and it looks quite impressive. They're not necessary to know how the whole operation's run. And Debord was in a position to historify the Situationists from his own perspective. Thus, in the English and French-speaking world, you hear very little about the Second Situationist International, and it's treated almost as if it was it had no legitimacy whatsoever, which I wouldn't agree with. So also I think we should think about this whole thing, how this whole thing's been historified. From this I'd like to move on and just repeat a couple of observations which have been made about the Situationists. One was made in a radical magazine called Here and Now, which came out earlier this year by a guy called Gus MacDonald, and he said something along the lines of the book Society of the Spectacle is the perfect art object for a specialist audience in that it contains homage, pastiche, reference to tradition, designed to be admired for its formalist perfection.
He's right.
Pardon?
He's right.
Yeah, I'd agree with him as well. I think it's a good observation. The second observation I'd like to repeat is made in a pamphlet called Situationist Failures, which came out in Paris last year. And the observation there's a lot of criticism of the Situationists in this book, but the most interesting one is the observation about the centre point of the Situationist myth from the Debordist perspective is May 68, and in particular a call for an occupation of the factories by the workers issued by the First Sorbonne Occupation Committee with Situationist participation. And this was issued on the 16th of May 1968. But what's interesting about this call for the workers to occupy the factories was that it was actually issued after the strikes started. So in effect it had no influence on the unfolding of events because the strikes had already started. But people defending the Situationists from a Debordist perspective often cite this as a vindication of their theory and the importance of the Situationists in the May 68 events, something which I think objective and informed observers would not take too seriously. So moving on from this, we can return to the issue of recuperation, and is this exhibition a recuperation? Now basically I think it's wrong, as some people would have you believe, that the Situationists had a total revolutionary critique. If you accept this, you're going to live out an ideology of your parents' generation, which I'm not very interested in. I'd rather live now. And if you, further than accepting that Situationists had a total revolutionary critique, if you accept on top of that it's been recuperated here, then what do? You say, oh, well, they had the total revolutionary critique and it's been recuperated. You might as well give up and do whatever society tells you to do, whatever role you've been allotted. So that's just what I wanted to say. That was basically it, because what I think, what happened in the past, it's useful to know about because you can take things from it, but you have to use it for your own purposes. You have to realise that history is created after the fact and not think that what's in there is something that you couldn't do with something as strong as now. And that's basically what I've got to say. What needs to be resisted is this idea that these people have this genius or something that you don't possess, and that in actual fact anyone is capable of doing an incredible amount of things. And this whole idea of recuperation tends to ignore the fact that you're a part of this society, so you reproduce it as well as contesting it. It's not as clear-cut as some people would like to make out, but also that you're capable of doing some fairly incredible things. I mean, for example, I'm sitting up here, I don't have a degree, I go and do the odd lecture in art schools and stuff. I don't even have a degree. I got thrown out of my degree. I went to a polytechnic. I got thrown out. So I'm just saying that, we're up here and you're down there, but it's, you could just as well be up here, and you don't want to take anything we say too seriously, because this whole idea of experts is fairly ridiculous.
Well, I think we should open up this to a conversation, finally. Would there be any questions that people would want to ask? If not, what time is it? I don't know. Does anyone have the time?
2:21.
Okay. It's, well, I guess part of your criticism would be directed at a guy like me, for whom this notion of resistance has been somehow surpassed by events in the marketplace. It seems to have been rendered moot, in a way, by events of the last 15 to 18 years, at least at the level of culture. And what we are left with is an older notion of negativity articulated by Terry Atkinson, of barricade negativity. But, for example, forms of resistance that the Sex Pistols are often linked with the Situationists. They, of course, represented this deeply negative, bile moment in the culture. But they raised their head through the apparatus of a very successful promotion device and the machinations of Malcolm McLaren and the industries themselves, the record industries themselves. So you might have to, one could say that this kind of negativity was in bed with, and can only be in bed with, certain devices in the media culture. The art market in New York, and to a certain extent elsewhere, is dominated now by art that takes criticism as a first principle, yet is thoroughly commodified. So I'm very puzzled by the conjunction of aesthetics and resistance, and wonder, does someone have something to add? Can others point to instances,
I don't know why you say this is a negative. It seems completely positive. Not necessarily being with the thing, but more expansion. That's not negative.
Right. Well, obviously I use the word negative in the sense of opposed to a dominant culture. Kind of.
It's not negative, though, is it?
Well, it's let's use another word. Oppositional. What? Counter-hegemonic. I mean, there are a number of words we could use. The negative is just the term applied by various philosophical traditions. But I take your point. Yes.
The whole framework of centering your notion of effective art, effective practice around the notion of resistance follow really from a terrible sort of void about what is positive. I guess it's a sort of collapse of utopic dimension to aspiration on the whole. The notion that you actually haven't got anything that you are going to advocate, and that moreover you never expect to be in a position to have to advocate. Simply that effective, ethical, political and artistic practice will always be just resisting. You'll never find it other than that. To go back to a position where positive initiative was placed, the art was placed in a position of having the possibility of taking positive initiative. I think you have to go back to the Russian 1920s. And it's highly characteristic of that movement called constructivism. Now, the thing is, I'd just like you to sort of frame this in that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure. Does anyone want to respond to that?
I mean, I say this because tomorrow there's a discussion about architecture. And if you're involved in architecture, you simply can't really deal with notion. Because the very fact that you're building means that in some sense you are resisting, not resisting. You know, I mean, the notion of resistance architecture is almost an oxymoron.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just a couple of things have occurred to me as we've been talking. I mean, 1968 was the kind of year that was important for me, and in all the kind of 20-year celebrations that went on last year, there was a lot of putting down, and it was a sort of bubble in the ocean, and we were kind of led to think, well, what actually survives from that period of time? And I think there's a couple of very important interrelated aspects that possibly have seeped out across the years. One is a feeling of a resistance to being institutionalized, in whatever institution might be drawing in or you might have aspirations in. And going hand in hand with that is the development of collaborative forms of working or collective forms of working, which in various cultural forms, whether they be theatre or whatever, where, it's not just the product that is the question, it is the very modes of power relationship between the people producing. And I think if there are ways in which, perhaps human beings' tendency to want to be on top of each other and call the shots to each other can be eroded or constantly watched against by the sorts of lessons that have been learnt by people who really struggled against power structures in the sort of forms of working they evolved. That may be one thing that we inherit, or that could be still useful or still at work somewhere in the culture. I mean, the other thing is to pick up your word of historification.
Yeah.
I agree with you absolutely, and very often, if you look at the histories of things, the people who have been guilty of historifications, talking of the project I'm on now about the history of the birth of the movies, are not historians. First off, they're lawyers, and they're lawyers doing it in order to make money or to win cases for people whose interest it is to retain power within those cultural structures. And I think. The process of writing one's own history is something that really is very difficult and very questionable. So maybe one thing that we need also to look at is processes of understanding history. And if the notion of truth is something always more complicated, then we have to deal with that too, rather than simple dualities or simple polarities of art and politics, of the individual and the collective and so on.
The problem with this show is that I was done such a bad research in it. I must say, there were guys up in Scandinavia. He was there for 2 days. One day he got pissed in Nash's farm, and the second day I talked to him, then he went to Legoland. That was his main interest. And I mean, doesn't it sound like a big church event? They're quoting every time from the Bible of the boy. Isn't that great? You're quoting every quotations. I was in this Situationist movement from the beginning of the 60s, and there's so many people who are living still and who can tell about what the hell it all was about. Why are they not here? None of them. What? They couldn't know they would be thrown out again. No, but what about the Straw people, for instance? Why are they not here? Why are they not here? Because you can make a myth which is so boring. And people say, well, you are quite right, because you can say, oh, the mass media are revolutionary now, and art market is revolutionary now, and so on. It's correct, because everything which is shown from the boy is so eatable now. Everybody accepts this.
I don't remember saying the mass media are revolutionary.
Oh, you said something of the like. And you're right, it's history. This is a big grave.
Yeah.
And you're just taking some skulls, like the Muslims, the Shiites and the Sunnis.
Yeah.
Muhammad never wrote a word. So now they're fighting who wrote the Quran. I think there should have been some more life in this show, and you should have had some of the Situationists here. That would be much more funny, because everybody on top of this exhibition.
What they did do at the beginning of the 60s and not what they're doing now.
I talked to them, the people who worked. Wait a moment.
The reason why everybody sounds so tired is they're talking about what they remember.
No, they can do a lot of things now. Everybody in the Situationist movement I talk to, they say, I can come to some quotations. Jürgen Ness say, this is a heap of junk. They never research anything. The Spur group say, oh, we got a kick in the ass. Or you heard what our friend up here said. Galizio say, this is a student event. It's nothing to do with the Situationist movement. And the problem is the Situationist movement was a very broad artistic movement. Many kind of individuals were in it and many kinds of expressions. And what they are doing now, they are making it to a new Bible. Just quotations. And you go to this exhibition, and what is it? It is not international situationist, it's international pamphletist. It's presented as a pamphletist movement. That's what I want to say.
Well, I mean, to a degree, I have to agree with what you're saying. We are in an arts institution, And the function of this institution is to assimilate and to shape art historical content. I mean, this is what we're doing. One can defend it, one can attack it. What is the alternative, I wonder? The alternative is an invisibility of the SI, a kind of continued cult status of the Situationists, where they, in fact, I reject this idea that what's going on here is a sacralization of the Situationists. On the contrary, I think what's going on with this institution is a leveling of the Situationist movement into a lineup with other movements in modern culture. The alternative would be a kind of fantastic romanticism that has always surrounded the Situationists, and which you, I think, contribute to.
Yeah, that's disgusting.
You know? Is that not, am I not right?
Yes.
So those are the choices with which we're faced, really. This kind of...
solve a lot of questions. For instance, the questions of art and politics. If some of the people could be here and speak. Because that's not a big question.
Right.
The question is against the Puritans and the non-Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
And the Boer was the Puritan and the other were the non-Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe your sort of notion of resistance to what, now, and why, is what we should pick up, because that's what people want to talk about, is the present in some way.
The most obvious concern that you are missing in terms of your question about what can be done in terms of resistance is one of the legacies in critical theory that the Situationists passed on, is the question of commodification. How much are you being paid to sit there on the lectern?
Not
20 quid.
Not very much.
20 quid.
We're talking about commodification.
One of the very essential questions of the 50s into the 60s into the 70s, the 80s, the question of commodification. That is a question that is historical and it continues on.
Sure.
And you're not raising that point. And you're asking what the question is, what can be done in terms of resistance when it's staring us in the face everywhere we go.
He raised that point repeatedly.
Did he really? But in explicit terms, in terms that we can understand. In terms that we can understand.
Well, I'm very interested in this idea of commodification. Yeah, I'm sure we're all very interested in this idea of commodification with the Situationists. Pardon me?
Our lives, our births, and our deaths are staked upon that, and that is what must be. We must address that question immediately.
But I think there's more than this. The problem is you're tending to privilege economic activity, and the point is, you said how much were we being paid to be up here, like 20 quid, so obviously that's not the only reason we're here, because I could get 60 quid by doing the same thing in an art school. You know, it actually pays less than other places, right? So obviously what we have to look at is that, exactly, you put it on your CV, and then you can go and get more jobs at 60 quid in an art school. So I think the thing is, to overemphasise the economic aspect of things is a mistake.
I don't think I'm overemphasising this, Stuart. I think I'm trying to provoke what I think has been obviously ignored, even though the gentleman says it's been repeated.
Yeah, no, I mean, it depends where people are coming from.
We're swimming in the culture of commodification. And my question would be, where are people refusing it? How is it being refused today? What is being done in culture, in other parts of social life?
Well, I think there's some quite interesting skill exchange networks where rather than paying someone to do your plumbing, you get someone in to do your plumbing and you teach them German in return or whatever else. I mean, that's a good example, but, you know... Yeah, I know, but it still works now, doesn't it? There's a lot of... rather than places like this, for example, in Glasgow there's a free university. In London, the Free International University was revived last year. There's a new university in Birmingham which has roots out in other places. There's all these skill exchange networks. But that is a... you know, it might have been done 100 years ago, but if it still works, it's still got some use, hasn't it?
Chris Rawlins mentioned collective production. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Well, I was saying, in the process of working in a theatre company that sets out to be a collective, one spends maybe 3/4 of the time working out the psychological dynamics of the individuals in quite traumatic circumstances. And a quarter of the time maybe performing theatre. And the question there, that over a period of years that one begins to reflect on is this a waste of time? Are the things that I'm learning as a person more important or less important than the theatre we're making? What is the relationship between the two of them? I'm not involved in that kind of theatre anymore. I work in a very hierarchical industry, which is filmmaking, where, you know, at the end of the day, you've signed a contract to produce something for somebody. If you don't sign that, if you don't deliver, you're in trouble. So there has to be some way, in my view, of marrying the best of collective working practices to the knowledge that at the end of the day, somebody's got to carry the responsibility for delivering something in this market economy within which I find myself operating. So that, on a very personal level, is how I negotiate something that I've been through, I would say, aesthetically and culturally, politically, over the last 20 years today, in trying to help the chemistry of a group of individuals work at its optimum for everybody to enjoy the work they're doing and produce of the best without feeling oppressed by the working structures that we're working in. I think it's fundamental because it goes way beyond the work practice. Sorry? I think it's very important, yes, because I think it affects the humanity of the product in the end. I say product, of what you're making. It makes all the difference to how who's going to view or participate or experience something relates to it. It is touched with soul. This is, in my view, fundamental, however directly or indirectly political or resisting something may or may not be. I think, as I was saying earlier, we get hooked and hung up on the polarization of cultural activity into art or message somehow, whereas maybe what we're dealing with is in a much more blurred area in the centre.
Well, there is a problem. The resistance to institutionalism is itself an institution now. I mean, in that the tale of the sort of congealment of the avant-garde, that the avant-garde, in its non-conventionalist, in what has traditionally been identified as its kind of anti-conventionalist stance, is itself conventional, is itself taken up, absorbed, regurgitated, and that goes for much of the work of the, what scare quotes we might call the aesthetic side of the Situationists. As Guillaume, there are many paintings by As Guillaume sitting in Silkeborg Museum in central Jutland in Denmark, and it seemed to me to be a very comfortable, comforting environment for that stuff to be in. And in one sense, his relation to lettrism and things like that is clearly laid out there, but it seems that nothing's activated. And that's what I was trying to suggest about the situation we find ourselves in.
I mean, picking up what you said about commodification, what seems to be one of the values that goes with that is a culture of lies. We live in a culture of lies, and it might sound rather naive to say this, but if resistance lies anywhere, it's in defining truth. And when we confront or face truth, maybe say in Kiefer's work, there is a blistering and difficult truth, to my mind, in the objects that the man is making. That is resistance. $250,000. Well, sure, but I wouldn't hold him responsible for that. I wouldn't hold him responsible for that.
He produces them more and more by the yard.
But the question is, how do people experience them?
Then they wouldn't be there anymore.
But I mean, is it a better or a worse thing that Kiefer's art exists in the world?
But there's nothing.
In this situation, it's ridiculous.
There's nothing logically absurd about acts that might be called resistant becoming the objects produced by acts that might be called resistant becoming expensive. I mean, there's nothing logically.
There's something logically absurd about perceiving truth, in this blistering truth in Kiefer's work, which costs $250,000. Obviously, it isn't resisting a culture of lies.
Well, what? I mean, a quarto of Shakespeare's going to cost you $1 million.
This is a culture of lies.
I'm confused. That's the problem. In the middle of this debate, could you tell me what the difference is between a true commodity and a false commodity?
I didn't say a true commodity. Well, a true commodity in the value that something bears, At the end of the day, is what I was trying to say earlier. You, at the end of the day, take the courage to trust your own judgment. And if you've been told that Rembrandt's great all your life, but you didn't know why, and then one day you look at a self-portrait and see something you perceive to be true about your own condition in it, that's all I mean.
It's objective truth.
I didn't say objective. Well, it has a meaning insofar as a group or a collective might adhere collectively to the notion that it has meaning in the act of resisting something else.
Just 1 second. Just 1 second. Despite what we want to believe, that the art market is completely bereft and thoroughly commodified, there are people who manage to insert ghosts in the machine, so to speak. There's this fellow, for example, named Krzysztof Wodiczko. Maybe you're familiar with his work. He's essentially a nocturnal sort who goes around with a projector at night and projects various stolen images on the faces of institutional buildings. So, for example, in New York, a 30-story building owned by AT&T, the telephone conglomerate, a building without windows, at night became the projection screen for Wodiczko's work, which was a human hand just posed on the face of this building for 30 to 45 minutes before the police arrived. A hand on a building whose interior is full of machinery and digital equipment and so forth. And there was another instance that comes to mind. On the facade of the Bundestag in Bonn, does someone refresh my memory here? Wodiczko projected a swastika for, again, 30 to 45 minutes before the police arrived. So this kind of neo-situationist activity continues to go on. Obviously, this is art that's thoroughly uncommodifiable. What can be bought? What can be sold in this?
Slides.
The slides, right.
Pictures of the event.
Wodiczko publishes the slides. I don't believe that they're available for purchase, Okay, so I stand corrected.
That's what the discussion is about.
Right. You see, it's interesting that as soon as one tries to, bring up an example, all of us have the reflex to jeer. Me, myself included. It's curious.
It's not to jeer, it's just to say.
It's just that it's wrong to posit that it's somehow radically undermining the structure
Okay,
of the art.
all right. I'm open to other examples. I'm open. Yeah.
I'm very intrigued by the assumption that the word commodification is a bad thing. We're living in the 1990s, or will be. And there's obviously very different understandings about what is wrong about the commodity. Now, De Boer, at least, has a concept of the commodity coming from Hegel, which is bound up with a notion that the commodity reifies human relations. Now, when people talk in the art world about commodification and anti-commodification, they forget about the theory and the concept of the commodity, and then it ends up with this kind of silly moralistic thing about prices and artworks. Commodification isn't to do with the nature of the art, it's to do with the social relations around it. If you're wanting a struggle against commodification, one should at least understand what is wrong about the commodity.
Can I just ask you that? It leaves us